Good. All right. Let's see. All right. So welcome, Beth Dunn, and congratulations on your book, Cultivating Content Design. Tell us more about it.
Sure. So this is actually a book that the folks at A Book Apart approached me to write after some of the people at that company saw me give a talk at Confab, which is like the big content conference in the States, in Minneapolis. And it was all about what I had learned from growing a content design practice at HubSpot and building it from being a solo practitioner to an integrated global team, which is a really tough move for everybody, I think, who attempts it. So I was trying to share what I had learned and some of the methods and mindsets that helped me along the way. And it actually took a little bit of convincing that it was something that would be of broad enough interest because it is a fairly niche situation. But I am really writing it for that person who is doing content and wants to scale what they do. It turns out it's been really useful for people who are not necessarily working in content as their primary job, but to understand the world of content and how we see things and the challenges that we face so that they can help scale content along with us.
Great. And so I know that some of our participants are calling in with diverse backgrounds in marketing communications and also some with more of a tech background. And one of the things that struck me from looking at the book is there's this term full stack content design.
That's right. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what does that mean?
Absolutely. So I think a lot of people are familiar with, or at least they've heard in passing, the term full stack engineer, right? And that just basically means that you're an engineer who can manage all the layers, right? The front end, the back end, security, infrastructure, right? You're not kind of a specialist on just one part of it. Maybe you are, maybe you have a strength in a certain area, but you can do the full stack. Now in UX, the stack that we think about are basically the 7 layers of UX. And I don't know if somebody needs to mute themselves or something, but it's getting a little noisy here. And so the 7 layers of UX, which is popularized by Jesse James Garnett, I kind of simplified that down into 3 layers, which is strategy and scope on the bottom, structure in the middle, and surface at the top. And what that means is that content designers, full stack content designers, actually have a really strong and active and powerful role to play at each layer of the UX stack, basically. And I go into a lot of detail about what you can expect a content designer, a full stack content designer, to do for a project. And this is whether it's in tech, product, marketing. I'm now in internal communications. It's all the same. Right? Scoping and figuring out what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, getting the structure together. Structure involves things like accessibility, learnability, usability, information architecture, all of that. And then surface, which is really proofreading and polish, wordsmithing, as they say, voice and tone. That's that little scrape on the top is what most people tend to think is what content people do. And that's just literally the tip of the iceberg. It just goes all so much further down than that. So that's the first thing I talk about in the book, is to rethink what you can get out of yourself as a content person and out of the content people that you work with.
All right. So that's full stack content design.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also, you also write about content first.
Yeah, content first is an approach where you just sort of make sure that the content person in your organization, and that may or may not be somebody who has content in their title, right? There's actually a lot of conversation in the content world about, sometimes you are working with somebody on a project who is just going to be the designated content person. That may be your designer, may even be your engineer, but content should be a job that is assigned to somebody on any project. And the point is that you make sure that they are wearing that hat and that content person is in the room in all conversations from the start. So it's a content first approach. There are also methods to content first that ensure you are building content into the process from the very beginning. One of the things I like to do with people is start to sort of wireframe or build a flow without any visual elements at all. It's just content. It's literally just sort of sketching together. First this happens, and then that happens, and then that happens, and it's low resolution content that the user might encounter at various stages of the game. And then you start to connect the dots and think about what needs to get wrapped around that content. So that's a content first approach to building a user flow, because you start with the words and ideas and metaphors and mental models, and then you build the experience around that.
So this book is all about being a content leader.
Yeah.
Can you just share a little bit more about how this book came about?
Sure. I mean, all right. So it probably makes sense to just talk about my history a little bit. I've been at HubSpot, which I think people are usually familiar with at this point. We're a CRM platform company. I've been at HubSpot since 2010. So we were a very small startup at the time. And I was just doing customer onboarding like most of us who got started there. And I very quickly became the person who was identifying ways that the interface could be more user-friendly, could make more sense, and specifically the words. So I was a self-designated nudge going around to all the engineers and saying, would you please fix this? Would you change that? The customers don't understand this or that or whatever. And people were very happy to hear from somebody as to what needed to get fixed. So that all went well. I was encouraged. And then we hired our first director of design, Josh Porter, who went around and asked people what they did, and I told him that, and he said, "Oh, you're my UX writer. You do microcopy," and I had never heard those terms before, and he just made that my full-time job. So now I was a full-time UX writer, and I learned, with Joshua, who already had a vision for what UX writing was and should be. So I was very fortunate in that regard. And I was a UX writer. I was the only UX writer for the product team, which was a pretty big product team already, and then grew very quickly over the next 5 years. I was the only UX writer for a really long time. And so I firsthand experienced the pains of that and saw the lost benefit that was kind of slipping through our fingers all of the time, because I knew that I could add more value earlier in the process, deeper in the stack, but all I really had time to do was, I remember at the time I felt like a cook. People would put in orders, say, could you just edit this? And I turn it around. I just, nope, here's the soup. I just turn it around. But that's really staying right at the surface. And it was great. I had a lot to do. My time was full, but I found that I was spending 90% of my time correcting apostrophes, or getting rid of exclamation marks, or just doing this, like, really, I was like, you could probably get a bot to do this. I eventually did end up building a bot, which they still use, called BethBot, that has our style guide in it. And you can run any content through it and it will say, don't use an exclamation mark there. And that's not how apostrophes work. And so I offloaded a lot of that onto this bot that I built. And then that freed me up to be able to go deeper stack. And I was doing a number of other things too. So building the bot, kind of socializing what content design can do through a series of workshops. And then the other main move was that I started writing a company newsletter, which was not about content at all. It's just about our culture, about things that were going on. But I used it as a sort of a Trojan horse, sort of to infiltrate people's minds with our voice and tone. And that got people to say, oh, Beth is the person who writes in our voice and tone better than anybody else. I'm going to send her my stuff. And so this got me out of product, right? So salespeople, marketing people, internal comms, whatever, executives were saying, would you please revise this? So I was able to show them how content design could work on stuff that mattered to them. So those are some of the moves that I talk about in the book, about how a solo person can actually start to influence things in really scalable ways.
Great. So we already have the first question in the chat, and that's from Neil, which I think actually connects with what you just talked about, the BethBot.
Yeah.
But taking it to the next level, as usual with Neil, he's asking, how do you see artificial intelligence enhancing content publishing?
Okay, how do I see artificial? I mean, so there's a lot.
BethBot versus version 2.
Yeah, I mean, so Beth Dunn is fairly straightforward, right? It's just a bunch of statements. Like if you see this word, please tell them to use this word instead, or this punctuation mark or
Don't
whatever.
use unprecedented times.
Yeah, no, exactly. And there's a lot of that where like if it's a phrase that we really don't ever want to see in life again, I can say no, never say that. Never say that. And I definitely had a lot of those, and that's one of them. um, uh, so it doesn't have any natural language processing. There's no AI involved in it whatsoever. How do I see that playing a role? I see it playing a role very similar to how we use BethBot, which is to sort of give it a job, right? And I'm talking as a producer, right? As a producer and a manager of content within an organization, not necessarily within the interface or the engagement with the user or the customer. To give it a specific job within bounds that frees up human beings to do what human beings do. So I honestly, I'll be honest with you and say I don't have a whole lot of experience working with artificial intelligence. So that's about as far as I'm going to go with that.
All right, that works too. Thank you, Beth. And the book is just out. It's a month ago, I think it came out.
Yeah.
And now that it's been a month and you've gotten plenty of feedback and all of that, anything that you would already now tell this audience that might make it for inclusion in the next edition?
The next edition. Taking it a step further, basically, the book takes you up to the point of where you're starting to build and grow a content practice. And for a lot of people, that's going to mean headcount. For a lot of people, that's going to mean you're starting to build a team. And in my earlier drafts, I had several more chapters. I had chapters about how to hire people, considerations around organizational structure. Should they all report up to you or to a manager, or should it be distributed? Or so organizational design and kind of strategic, organizational-wide strategic work, how to work with executives, things like that. So I would say that would probably be the next step. What's amazing is that a really good friend of mine, Rachel McConnell, I think she's writing that book right now. So there's going to be, she actually wrote this great book called Why You Need a Content Team and How to Build One, which goes through a sort of content maturity model that I found very helpful when I was starting to grow my team and think about organizational design. So I learned a lot from reading that book and from conversations with her. Anybody who's thinking about that, I highly recommend picking up that book and keep an eye out for her forthcoming book.
All right, I'll make sure to include that in the notes. Perhaps one of the final questions from my side, and similar to Neil, anybody else feel free to jump in, ask a question in the chat. But it seems to me that this book is also about change, how to drive change. Any unique insights from the book you can share on this evergreen topic of change?
Evergreen topic of change. Yeah, it's funny too that you had spoken to Mr. Fogg about tiny habits, because I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan of that and that method of kind of initiating personal change and in your own life. And I mean, just to take a step back, I think that to talk about like a unique insight in the book, I think the main mindset that I'm advocating for is a bit of a unique one, which is that change shouldn't be an adversarial process. The solo content people, I find the people that I talk to are very frequently, they feel embattled, they feel overwhelmed, they feel like people don't get them, they don't understand them. And so they usually start off from a place of feeling very like us versus them. And I really try to break people out of that mindset and to help them instead identify the people. I always said to my team members when they were trying to work with us, I said, work with the people who get it, right? So there are always going to be people around you who are like, you're just a proofreader, or why would I bring you into our strategy talk? There's nothing for you to edit. Like they just won't get it until they see it done. And so work with the people who get it so you can show them how it's done. Telling people what it would look like is rarely helpful, right? So I really just try to get people to change that mindset from one of us versus them to we're all in this together. And all you really have to do is just focus on the people that fit that definition. Work with the champions, identify the champions in any sorts of roles, you will be happier and you will make more headway. So it's a win-win.
There you go. You make it sound so easy.
I know.
Any questions, comments, reflections from the participants? You can raise your hand using the feature in Microsoft Teams, or you can just ask a question, ask away on the chat. I know also we have Hillary Marsh on the call.
That's great. Hi.
Hillary, brief comments from your side? I know it's early morning from you. I think you've already had your first cup of coffee, right?
8:20, but Beth, I think you're in Minneapolis, so it's right, aren't you?
No, I'm actually on Cape Cod.
Oh, Cape Cod, so you're an hour later. So content design picks up where content strategy leaves off. And so everything you've said, I have been nodding like crazy. And I think that from what I understand, and I have not yet had a chance to see your confab talk or get your book or any of that because I was multitasking last week and client work and mother visiting, blah, blah, blah. But you've kind of embedded a lot of the principles of content strategy into your work and maybe didn't name it that. I find that for my work, content strategy starts with all of those why questions and then makes sure that each person executing it, whether it's a content designer, a writer alone, or a subject matter expert bringing it most of the way along and then having somebody apply the organization's voice and tone. So there's lots of different dynamics and relationships that you could use. But for me, content strategy establishes how that's all going to work, what the principles are, what the voice is, and then it can sort of take off the rest of the way. And the idea of content strategy is stitching it together across the organization so that if you have a government agency or a large organization, that each content designer isn't eventually going so far into the subject matter expertise themselves that they become isolated or siloed, even if they don't want to, And so how do we bring us all back together? How do we create the structures, the process, the standards to make sure that we're all still rowing that boat together in the same way? Because the customer doesn't want a different experience for this product or this product, or and they don't want to see disconnects between the sales process, the onboarding, any ongoing support, and the core product information. And those people don't always talk to each other. So how do we make sure it's all connected and stays connected? And at the heart of all of that is a people issue for me. So I'm agreeing with everything you've said.
Right. I'm not hearing a question there.
No, I don't necessarily have a question per se. Just
nodding with you. That's exactly what it is. And I think that, one of the things that I really realized when I was writing this book, of course, really what it is just kind of sharing my experience, right? And what had worked and what hadn't, didn't really share a lot of what hadn't, but it was basically that what I had done is gone through a change management process using content strategy, right? The workshop, especially the workshops, talk a lot about when people raise their hand and say, will you please help me with this speech? An executive comes to you or a salesperson says, will you please help me with this, whatever. What you do is you treat them as your user and you design the workshop around them and say all right, so what is the metric that matters to this person? They want to get more leads. How can this piece of content help them get more leads? How can I teach them about how content design works by helping them achieve that goal? And so it was basically, change management by doing user-centered content strategy across the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Very meta, but it really works.
Well, the whole idea of establishing the real goals of your content, because even the idea of leads, they don't want leads, they want customers.
That's right, they want customers. Yeah, and so you have to kind of work with them. But the thing is, that's what they're getting measured on. If they're getting measured on leads, you have to work with the metric that matters to them, right? That's the raw material that you have to work with, and you have to take it one step at a time and meet people where they are, as you know.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
All right. So on the terms, Hillary talked about content strategy. The book here is Cultivating Content Design. We
Mhm.
also have quite a few members who speak about content operations.
I knew you were going to say that, Giannis. Yeah. So content
So
operations for
easy, huh?
me is is putting all that stuff into action every day with the right people. And so Beth, you said the magic word, which is it's got to be somebody's job.
Yeah.
And so not only do you have to have the principles in place, you have to build it into that daily work.
Yeah.
Everyone's daily work who's supposed to be responsible because no one's going to do it in their spare time.
That's right. You have to set it up into the systems and processes, and that's a lot of work, and it's a lot of different work. And this is really interesting in the field of content design because I'm seeing a lot of people like me who kind of came up through UX writing, and then we're like, oh, now I have to learn how to grow a team and do organizational design and be a people manager and all this other stuff that has little to do with being a UX writer. And then you have to think about things about operations and design. And that's another whole world of change management in itself. So it's never a dull moment, really.
There you go. I was thinking one thing we could use, if you don't mind, Beth, is how about an anecdote from your years of content design work? Can you tell us like a story from the real world in terms of lessons learned working on this?
It's very broad. I'm trying to think.
Pick one. I'm pretty sure you've experienced so much. Just pick one hard-earned lesson, perhaps.
One hard-earned lesson. Well, I guess the thing that pops into my mind, and I know I talk about this a lot in the book, is that it's got to be a shift it starts with a shift in mindset in yourself, right? A lot of people that I wrote the book for are these solo practitioners who are very bound up in their self-identity as wordsmiths, as the guardians of the words and the guardians of correctness and things like that. And I actually wrote a piece for the HubSpot blog years ago called "Do You Really Need That?" exclamation mark. And it was a humor piece, right? It had like a flow chart that basically all of the paths ended in no, because I really don't think you need exclamation marks, especially in marketing copy. That's really what it was about. And then all of a sudden, forevermore, I'm branded as the person who hates exclamation marks, and people still apologize when they send me a Slack message or an email with an exclamation mark, or they won't apologize, but they'll say like, and yes, I stand by that exclamation mark, which is amazing because that was, 8 years ago now. And I never was trying to police people's personal use of exclamation marks. I just don't like them in like CTA buttons and, email headlines and things like that. So I would say, that sort of thing hounds you. And it was just, to me, an object lesson in being really careful about how you brand yourself. I was really strongly branding myself. I mean, I got interviewed by NPR. I was on a bunch of people were like, oh, let's talk to the woman who hates exclamation marks. And that will follow you around. And if you're trying to grow a content practice and get people to understand that content is much more than the surface, and you've already branded yourself as the keeper of the surface, it's going to be even more of an uphill battle. Like, this is why people don't invite you to strategy meetings, because you're constantly banging on about exclamation marks. I'm saying you, I mean me, right? And so it's really, you have to let that go. And that's why I actually, one of my subject lines is, or section headers is, nobody cares about your style guide. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't have style guides, but that we need to stop waving them around as if other people would use them, or care about them. And that's not actually getting us where we want to go. So that's my anecdote.
Thank you for sharing that, Beth. I shared the link, and I'll make sure to include it as well. Like you said, originally published in January 2015.
Yes. Yep.
So Neil asked another question in here. If you have considered turning the book into an online course on LinkedIn Learning or Coursera, seems like it'll be valuable in an interactive learning process.
I have had that suggested to me, and I think that I'm definitely going to consider it. I would have to think about it in different ways, of course. But I love curriculum design and thinking about how to teach. I'm actually a teacher at heart. So yeah, that's definitely a possibility. Good to know that you're interested.
There you go. Any other closing questions, remarks, feedback, things you agree with or disagree with? I can keep calling on people just like I did with Hillary,
That
but
was great.
let's see. Thank you, Hillary. Torstein, so far so good in Oslo?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for a great talk so far. Just a question to kind of round it up. How do you see the sort of the connection and the collaboration with the, let's say, the other design disciplines? It's content designers, and suddenly we're designers now, but how do we keep on collaborating with the other designers?
You know, I've had all manner of partnerships with designers, and because people are human, and there's a lot of variety. And there are designers I've worked with who are incredibly strong in content, and it was a sort of a light touch but a deep partnership between us. And there are designers who are like, oh my God, thank God you're here. I don't want to make any decisions about this sort of thing. And then I think in the middle ground, there are designers who have not a whole lot of experience in doing content, but they really want to learn and like add it to their skill set. And I think that makes a whole lot of sense. I think that there's also a growing awareness that no matter where the skill set lies for different members, for like a designer or something who's supposed to kind of have a full suite of tools, it really makes a lot of sense to have these sort of specialists on projects where content is going to be important to the experience, which, as we're all learning, is basically all experiences. So,
thank you very much, Beth.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We made it just on time. Thank you very much for doing this. A pleasure, and congratulations once again on the book. Highly recommend it. And like I said, I will share the notes and the link, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Terrific. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.